if you were at the very cutting edge, bearing in mind Nine Souls is a very contemporary game, for my Taiwanese adventure, I've gone right back to the 90s, to a sort of Wild West time for publishing. Because back then, to release games for a home console like the Mega Drive or the SNES, you'd need to have worked out licensing and manufacturing deals with Sega or Nintendo as the platform holders. And in some regions, market penetration of hardware itself just meant that pushing for that sort of official agreement wasn't really worth it for a lot of teams and companies. So the Mega Drive, for example, it was sold in Taiwan and China, but in both countries, official sales were totally eclipsed by clone consoles, like fake Mega Drives that were reverse engineered from official tech to allow regional manufacturers to sell a comparable experience at a greater profit. And that's kind of how it worked in a lot of countries. Very similar in Russia and lots of Europe as well. It's just how things evolved as these consoles were getting bigger. That meant the games would often release that, while ostensibly a proper Mega Drive title, say, would not carry any Sega branding and would have a near zero chance of ever being localized for other regions. And in addition to that, would be of variable quality, owing to them having never been through hardware quality assurance that Sega would have provided. By quality here, I'm not talking strictly about, critically debatable, was it good or bad, but rather, will it work? Do I need to be concerned that this could damage my machine? Because like back with the Nintendo Gold stamp of quality that they used to put on all their games, that didn't mean every game was a banger to play, but it did mean that every game could be finished and would run on stock hardware.
Yeah.
That's basically what that sticker was saying. So there's a lot of games unique to Taiwan from this period then that we just never got anywhere else. Developers can be very hard to pinpoint, as games were often credited to shell companies or aliases and things like that. But through research, I'm reasonably confident the things I've been playing do come from the country, I think, probably. So I put time into 4 different Taiwanese Mega Drive games: Brave Battle Saga, Magic Girl, Water Margin, and Canon, The Legend of the New Gods. And I picked these 4 specifically because they've all been localized and now released physically in the West by publisher Piko Interactive as both modern kind of bootleg carts you can put in a stock Mega Drive, but also, more interestingly for me, on a single Evercade collection called Piko Collection 1. Piko are a brand that basically hoovers up old licenses for unknown or unloved sort of games from around the world that have had their licenses expire, and then they will often re-release the games on physical media for dead hardware. So they sell Mega Drive games, SNES games, N64 games, stuff like that, or for release on digital platforms like Steam or to brands like Evercade. Their first Evercade cart was a mixed bag in terms of quality of game, but I thought it was really interesting that 4 of, I think, the 20 games on that cartridge were from Taiwan, and they were games that we'd never had in this country officially before that point. So they ended up being kind of real standouts just because they were different. So Brave Battle Saga first, developed by Xuanpu Technologies. This is a relatively traditional exploratory turn-based RPG, as you kind of expect from a lot of RPGs of the 16-bit era. The majority of my time with this game actually predates the Evercade release, when I found a fan translation online. It was reasonably tough to find. It was before things were kind of quite as readily available as they are now. And these days, like I say, you can get it on Evercade cart. It's much, much easier to pick up. And you can even get it on Steam right now. I checked this morning. It's £2.50 in a current sale, and I'm sure it will be again in the future. But I would highly recommend, if people do want to try this one, whether that's on Steam or Evercade or anywhere else, do it with a Game FAQs guide in the background, because it's quite hard sometimes to pass what it's asking you to do in terms of like town busy work and puzzles before dungeons and stuff like that. Do you need to speak to certain characters with certain items, that sort of thing? It wasn't that clear when I was trying to make my way through before. When I played it as well, there was basically no resources online. So I did just get stuck because I was trying to watch along like a Let's Play video on YouTube. And I just thought, this isn't a fun way to play a game. So these days, I'm sure there's lots of easier avenues to give it a go. But it's, an average to decent mid-90s RPG. Magic Girl is the weakest game of this tetralogy by quite some distance. Developed by a team called Gamtech. This is an anime-inspired vertically scrolling shooter, but one that you could easily be mistaken for thinking was an NES title, given the game's horrible audiovisual presentation. It is really grubby. Nothing is communicated very well. It's got a total lack of feedback to explain once you've been hit or if you're even dealing damage to an enemy. The scrolling is really choppy, like an old DOS game. There's horrible sprite flicker. All in all, it's just not a very nice time. I really tried to find the fun with this one because I was trying to put myself in the mindset that, okay, this is a lower budget shooter. It was likely developed by a very small team with limited hardware access and know-how. But even comparing it to something as relatively lush and expansive, if frustrating, as Brave Battle Saga, which would have been made under very similar conditions, it's just not worth your time. It's really shit. The next game, Water Margin, big improvement. It's a side-scrolling brawler that plays closest to something like Golden Axe. It comes from a lovely, evocatively titled developer that goes by the name Never Ending Soft. And it's apparently loosely based on a famous Chinese novel of the same name. In its original release, it borrowed sprites and sounds quite liberally from a Capcom fighting game called Knights of the Round. But in its Piko/Evercade release, all the copyrighted content was tweaked enough to prevent lawyers coming knocking. So it's actually kind of a unique release of this game versus how it would have been played in Taiwan in the 90s, which in itself is quite interesting to me, at least. It plays really well, even if it's a bit derivative. You've got 3 different selectable characters. They all change the feel of the game enough that I was compelled to go through it with each. And although it doesn't have the depth of something like Streets of Rage, because the limited palette moves just doesn't sort of combine in quite the same way that the Sega Classic does, this is probably the game I return to most on the Piko cart at all. And it's the main reason why whenever I do travel with my Evercade, that cart comes with me, because I quite enjoy just 20 minutes of whacking things around on an old scroll and beat 'em up. Very easy to pick up and play. Finally, we have Canon, Legend of the New Gods. This is by far the game I've played the most of this set, though not particularly recently. Longer listeners of the show might remember me playing through and beating it all in mid-2023. And it was developed like Brave Battle Saga by Xuanpu, and this is a strategy RPG that cribs primarily from kind of Shining Force in its gameplay. The story is based on Chinese folklore, but I found it largely incomprehensible across the 25 hours it took to beat, because there are lengthy dialogue scenes between almost all of the game's 36 battles, and the number of characters introduced means it can be really hard to follow. Like if you were reading a novel with this breadth of cast, you'd at least be afforded like a chapter on each, or like some more background or scene settings to support each one. But in a game like this that was on the Mega Drive, it's got little truncated text boxes, you've got like single lines of dialogue. It can be very hard to remember who's who, what their motivations are at any given moment. Like it's really hard to follow. The sprite art is functional, a bit nondescript, and there's no large-scale character portraits in like dialogue scenes either. So again, unless you're looking really closely and trying to figure out which pixel character is talking, it's quite tough. You know, the localization is fine. It's very one voice, which I think, again, doesn't help. Like after beating the final boss, 2 characters that I had in my party since the very start of the game said something along the lines of, well, guess we should get back to heaven then. And I was genuinely shocked, as I was totally unaware they were even meant to be heavenly beings at all. And I'd read all the dialogue, you know, I'd played the whole game. I hadn't slept through it, but at no point did I realize, that's where they came from. That's the backstory. So, you know, it is what it is. The game itself is really strong, though. The stages themselves vary in difficulty. They require some real strategic thinking, especially in kind of the latter kind of chunk of the game. You need to learn the strength of your attacks of all of your party, but also the enemies in the stage too, to know what's going to hit me, how far do their kind of area of effect actually like extend on the grid. And you need to really think about kind of where they're going to move next and sort of plot ahead. Some later encounters face you off against enemies that have huge health reserves and devastating attacks, and it's a fun challenge kind of organising your party in a kind of pattern across the field just out of their range to then know on your turn you're storming in with 15 characters at once to kind of do mega damage. And it's a good time, you know. There's also some surprisingly effective set pieces dotted throughout the game as well that sort of betrays the game's humble, unlicensed Mega Drive roots. So there's a stage where you need to take down like a named enemy before a village is burnt to the ground, and the sort of stage is deforming in real time. There's a stage where your party is crossing a bridge as it's crumbling turn by turn. There's dungeons with multiple routes and kind of regenerating demon assailants that mean you have to constantly push your party forwards. This all might be kind of relatively bread and butter fare if you're the type of person who's played every single Fire Emblem game or laughs in the face of kind of all the late game challenges in Disgaea. But I generally don't give RPGs of any flavour much time. So as a novice, I thought it was all really cool. So a little mini ranking of our 4 plucky upstarts from Taiwan. At the bottom, by far, is Magic Girl with a charitable 2 out of 10, if I'm being generous. Brave Battle Saga jumps up massively. Can have a 6 out of 10, you know, for what it is. I enjoyed it in part. Water Margin, I do come back to a lot to beat some people up. 7 out of 10. And Canon, by virtue of being the game that compelled me to play all the way through, can have an 8. It's a really interesting collection and a fascinating window into this period of 16-bit Taiwan development, because there's a lot of other games that fit into this kind of pool, but maybe just never had those English translations put on later. So they're kind of just out of reach. So yeah, interesting country.